to the Reality Revolution. I am your host, Brian Scott. Today is an important episode for this podcast. This is unlike any other episode. We have groundbreaking research and information that we're going to go over that really expands our understanding of the many concepts that Neville Goddard taught and what he was really trying to say about the afterlife. On many episodes of the podcast, I have discussed Neville Goddard's unique interpretation of the afterlife. And in an interview I had with Josiah Brandt, he asked me a question that I found to be quite profound and led me on this current rabbit hole that I've gone down. He asked me, is there any other place that we've heard about Neville Goddard's perspective of the afterlife? Now, if you don't know, or you're new to the podcast, Neville Goddard has a very unique explanation of what it's like when you die. It's not like anything else that we hear in any other doctrine of the afterlife. Neville Goddard explains that when you die, you return to your body at the age of 20. You only live your childhood once. And then you end up in your body, in a 20-year-old body, and you live your whole life again. You have the same fears, the same desires, and you fear death, just like you do in this one. You don't remember the previous life, you just start all over. And what he claimed is that we end up on what he calls the wheel of recurrence. He mentions the wheel of recurrence multiple times in his lectures, explaining that we end up on this wheel of recurrence after we die. He gives several explanations of this over a course of different lectures, explaining that in one case he visits a friend that has already died, implying that it's happening in vision or dream, and his friend has no idea that he has died. I found this to be very appealing myself because I had an experience in a dream where I had met my dad after he had died, and he had no idea that he had died. He was in a 20-year-old body. He was a veterinarian, and it was very powerful to me, and it had kind of confirmed this belief in the afterlife. Of course, we have the perspective of reincarnation discussed in Buddhism and Hinduism in many different schools, including the Law of One. Neville Goddard is saying that reincarnation doesn't exist, that you go back to when you're 20 years old, implying in another lecture that you may not end up on the same timeline. You may end up in the 1500s or the 2300s, but it's not linear. Saying that we continually end up on a wheel of recurrence over and over again until we awaken through a set of mystical experiences he described as the promise. Once you've experienced these things where you awaken as Jesus Christ, you move on from what he calls the wheel of recurrence. I found this fascinating, and I had been reading this information, and on a recent trip got a chance to visit many of the places behind the stories we tell when we talk about Neville Goddard. I saw the place where Abdullah lived, where he slammed the door on Neville, saying, "You are in Barbados." And we saw his building where he lived in Washington Square, where he imagined that he was there instead of being in the military. As I walked the steps and went to these magical places, I became aware that I had tuned into something I didn't know that I could tune into. I could see not just one, but many of the different lifelines that Neville had experienced by going to these different places. Sharing in the oneness, I could feel a resonance with his particular timeline. We were all together. We were all focusing on Neville. And as we went to each of these places, I really felt like I had experienced many, many of the lives that Neville did. And so that very night, after our wonderful trip, Mitch Horowitz shows up at the bar where we had a meetup afterwards. And it was just a wonderful opportunity to meet Mitch Horowitz. And I looked up on his Twitter, and he had made the most interesting comment about Neville Goddard's death, quoting an amazing lecture from 1969 called Enter the Dream. We have not read this lecture yet for the podcast, but of course, we will be doing so quite soon. In Enter the Dream, Neville Goddard gives an explanation of this recurrence because he's experienced the promise and he's been given a vision. So he can see everything that ever happened at this point. And what he says is, in his book, John tells it in a lovely way. As I came out from the Father and came into the world, again, I am leaving the world and returning to the Father. So we did not begin here, but coming out from the Father, we found these garments that seem to begin in time, but really are an eternal part of the structure of the universe. In my own case, this little garment seemed to begin in 1905, Neville says. But it was always so. It was always growing into manhood and departing in its 60s. Always appearing, occupied by God, moving towards a certain point, and then disappearing. This lecture implies that Neville Goddard had a memory of this recurring life that he had lived over and over again, always dying in his 60s, coming back to when he was 20 and going over it and over it again. In my own life, in my book, The Reality Revolution, I hypothesized in my case that I had experienced a parallel reality shift, where I had a near-death experience, and during this experience, I could see all these different events happening, and I felt like I had experienced a shift, and now it's possible I might have been just simply seeing the way these events had occurred in previous lifetimes as I'd lived my own life over and over again. When I was talking to Josiah about this on our trip, he mentioned having lots of deja vu experiences, meaning that you've experienced this life over and over again in what is called the eternal recurrence, the eternal return. Do you experience deja vu on a regular basis? Well, I was just fascinated with this concept. And I've asked so many people that have come on the show and asked them what they think, how it works, and what their opinions are. I've done my best to try to learn more about this because it is so different, and in some ways it contradicts with things like the Law of One, because it's saying that reincarnation does not exist. Now, in the Law of One, there are subdensities, and it implies there are simulations that we can go through over and over to bring us to a certain level of awakening. So it's possible that this could still be occurring even with reincarnations. You could reincarnate and then live that same life that you reincarnate to over and over again. All of this could be nested together. It is a possibility. There is no fiction, but there is a discussion of this concept beyond Neville Goddard. This concept has been discussed as something called the eternal return, and it's also referred to as eternal recurrence. You've seen this discussed in movies. It's played out in movies and books that we've seen. One of my favorite books on the subject is called Replay by Ken Grimwood. Ken Grimwood had died an early death, but was this amazing author, and his own death is kind of described in this book, and it's called Replay, where he continues reliving his life. He starts going through his life, and then when he reaches 43, he dies and ends up 25 years old, and in that particular version, he has a memory of it and completely tries to live a different life each time. This was further explored in a book called The First 15 Lives of Harry August. Magnificent book. I loved it. This is another case where somebody can remember their lives as they're living it over and over. And another one that sort of is similar is Recursion by Blake Crouch. So this is being discussed in fiction. It is a concept that is a part of the consciousness. What I'm going to do in this episode is discuss where else it's been discussed. And in particular, the eternal return, or in German, it's called ewige Wiederkunft, is a concept that the universe and all existence and energy has been recurring and will continue to recur and is self-similar from an infinite number of times across infinite time or space. The concept is found in Indian philosophy and ancient Egypt and was subsequently taken up by Pythagoras and Stoics. With the decline of antiquity and the spread of Christianity, the concept fell into disuse in the Western world, with the exception of 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And then we have a discussion of it from Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. I want to read a little bit of what Neville Goddard says about the wheel of recurrence, and then discuss what is referred to as recurrence in Pythagoreanism and Stoicism, and even what the Christian response has been to this concept, and what Nietzsche said about it, and his understanding of it as a thought experiment. Even Martin Heidegger and then P.D. Ouspensky, who took this concept and expanded upon it as he learned from Gurdjieff, and even wrote about it in his book, The Strange Life of Ivan Osokin. In his book, A New Model of the Universe, he describes eternal recurrence. All of this is fascinating. And when read together, it is so amazing and so exciting that it completely changes the fundamental ideas we have of the universe, our lives, the afterlife, and everything. Right now in this moment, you might have experienced it 1,000 million times. Doesn't that make you want to make every moment count if you're going to experience it over and over? Well, it's the truth. Let's look at the possibilities that there is some truth in this from these statements. Now, we go to Neville Goddard, and he refers to the wheel of recurrence hundreds of times in multiple lectures. Surprisingly, you will find it in many different Neville Goddard lectures, and more than I even realized. In the lecture Eternity Within, in 1966, Neville Goddard discusses recurrence, saying, what's the use of the world if we are just going to repeat it over and over? Claiming, but if there's no escape from a world of recurrence, what would it matter if you could perform miracles, be worshipped by all, and possess the world, if in the end you would say vanity of vanities, all is vanity? But Koheleth, the preacher, meant something far deeper than that. It is marvelous to know that the whole drama of life is taking place in your imagination, that you have the choice of life and death, good and evil, blessings and cursings, that you can, by assumption, have a rich and wonderful life where everything is a blessing. But if in the end, when you close your eyes for the last time, you realize it was all vanity, would you not question, what did it matter? That is what Koheleth is summing up. He is telling us that there is something greater and to wait for the fullness of time. When? No one knows, not even the Son, only the Father. But in the fullness of time, that which was placed in the mind of man will be revealed. Now let me repeat it. He put eternity into man's mind, yet so that man cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. We have a mention in his lecture, Grace versus Law, in 1963, saying, if there was no other than the wise use of law to own the whole vast world and yet not to be redeemed from the wheel of recurrence, this would become the most horrible hell in the world. Fortunately, God started in the beginning a plan of redemption and its grace, where he saved us from the wheel of recurrence. And what is his greatest secret? Where he picks you at one moment of time, picks another at another moment of time to put him into that eternal structure, the everlasting temple, not made with hands. I do not know. I only know he promised us to build a temple for us, anonymous. We are the temple. We are the temple of the living God, a temple in which God will dwell, and yet we are free beyond the wildest dream of man, for we are God himself in the spot we call the New Jerusalem. So we have an understanding here that Neville's saying it's not just recurrence, that we're not stuck in this time loop forever and ever, that would be a terrible hell for us to go into, that there is a plan and that it is all for the good. He then mentions the wheel of recurrence in another lecture, I Am the Cause. on October 19th, 1969. And here he says, this world is based upon a circular principle, which repeats itself over and over again, whereas redemption is based upon a spiral principle. Breaking away from the wheel of recurrence, one moves up in a spiral motion like the seraphim and is redeemed. We are told that as the lightning shines from the east to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. This gives us a visual demonstration that we can move beyond the wheel of recurrence in ascension, moving in a spiral pattern upwards. He then mentions this in his lecture, Judas the Revealer, saying that every one of us exercises the right to turn this wheel of recurrence as we pass through the same scene over and over again. This lady saw a scene in the year 1778. I have entered scenes just as solid and real as this room, knowing that if I arrested an activity in my imagination, everything will stand still. I've entered a restaurant and observing people being served, I've arrested an activity within me, and everything stills, releasing it. Everything continues as intended. The world is a play which has already been written. The players are merely actors on the stage, but getting carried away with the actions, you weep and laugh for becoming involved in the emotions of the unfolding acts. You do not realize it is only a play. So here he's emphasizing that the structure of what we're experiencing is sort of like a simulation or a play or drama that we're going through, and we're just playing a part in this role over and over again. We then have a discussion of this in the lecture Prophetic Blueprints. And he says, our time is always here, and this time is curved. And we are moving on a circle that is a recurring circle. And we have a short memory and cannot remember the things that have happened. Therefore, we cannot foresee the things that are going to happen, for this is a wheel of recurrence. Our time is always here, but he has tasted of the power of the new age and can only describe the satisfaction of that power of the new age, but cannot demonstrate it to the satisfaction of anyone in this age. Here he speaks of this power, and he knows and tells them quite firmly, you will experience it. He knows everyone will experience it. It was on this level. In this age, none believed it. It is too fantastic. He rises into a world completely subject to his imaginative power. Now here is a sign. And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. Bear in mind the symbol that this, the body, is the earth. And I, if I be lifted up from this garment called earth, I will call all men unto me. Neville mentions the biblical background behind this teaching, stating in the lecture that which already has been, stating, we will take a simple little verse and show you why it is not addressed to the natural man. Ecclesiastes 3:15. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. So when I hear that, I get this thought in my mind. He's finding people that have moved away from the normal everyday loop. If suddenly you're acting outside of the normal loop that's been played thousands and thousands of times, he or she, as in God, is drawn to you, stating, the natural man cannot grasp that for him, reality is based only on the evidence of the senses. The man of reason could justify the verse's end, saying, if it has any meaning, that the writer must mean recurrence. The sun comes every day, and the moon completes its cycle, and the seasons come and go. If we took a picture of the universe today, the scientists can compute how long it will take to return to this point in the picture. So the intellectual man could justify the verse, but that is not what is meant, for it is addressed not to the man of reason or the man of sense, but to the man of imagination. What is it all about? That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. He goes on in this lecture to talk about imagination being the key. In The Art of Dying, an amazing lecture from 1959, he says, we all feel so secure in recurrence. If we know that a thing is fixed and the next week things will be as they are today, I feel secure in that recurrence. I can have done something that violates the moral codes. I can have come from the wrong side of the tracks, but I can accept that, for I am used to it. But to say that something awakes in me and can become what it will, that is frightening to man. So we are told to awake out of sleep, for recurrence brings security to the whole vast world. One does what he does as if he did it in a nightmare, for God had to forget he was God to become man, and that whittling down to this level is the very limit of contraction. But then comes the awakening from the deep dream into which he threw himself to make me alive. So this lifting up power goes about setting men free, for God became man, that every man may in time awaken as God. Eventually the whole world will awaken, and the poem will be full bloom, and it will be noble beyond our wildest dreams, and then it will exist for us, and we will be one with the creator of the great poem. That is the art of dying. But how do we break this wheel of recurrence? How do we break this circle of recurrence? He speaks of this in The Coin of Heaven. I believe this is the first time he mentions it. This lecture was given in 1954, stating, "Now we are told there were two gifts given to man at birth. It doesn't mean this little birth when I left my mother's womb, but when I left the womb of my father, that is the grand womb, the womb of creation, when before the world was. He created me and made me perfect, and set me in this world for a purpose, educative purpose. But he gave me two gifts. He gave me his own mind, and he gave me the gift of speech, the very thing he used to create a world. So he spoke the world into being, and then gave me the gift by which he spoke the world into being. So he gave me the mind and speech. If I use the gift wisely and do it rightly, I will be led into the realization, into the fulfillment of my every desire. Not one is beyond my ability to realize. If I continually use it wisely when I quit the body, as the world calls a man dead, when I leave this into another dimension by the wise use of the same two gifts, I will be brought into the company of the blessed, if I awake. If I don't use it wisely, I continue my circle of sleep. If I use it wisely, I will break the circle of recurrence and rise beyond it into eternity. If I don't, I continue on the curved line of time and repeat it over and over until someday I awake, for I am destined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Now, this is before he's experienced the promise. So we have some concept that he was aware of it before it happened. And here we have a discussion of how we can remove ourselves from this wheel of recurrence by using it wisely. Neville proposed that we imagine for others in a positive way. So this is similar to the wheel of karma in that if you don't use it wisely, you return and start over, right? But it's still a little bit different. But Neville continually advocated the use of the imagination as a means of escaping the wheel of recurrence. But he would warn that you can get lost in it and end up still returning. He discusses this in the lecture The Rock, where he states, in the case of the gentleman I told you about, he's now a success and may perhaps forget how his success came to be. Quite often when people reach their goal, they turn their back on the ladder by which they did ascend and forget the God who gave it birth. I hope this gentleman remembers, because no one gets off the wheel of recurrence until he is judged perfect by the one who began the good work in him. Only then will the individual become superimposed upon the Son of God to form the one God and the Father of all. Here, he is saying that we are judged perfect. We're going through this. It's sort of like a school. We repeat these experiences for a reason. In the lecture, Where Are You From?, Neville goes on and further discusses Ecclesiastes. Now listen to these words. What had been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages past. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to happen among those who will come after. Ecclesiastes 1:9-11. Well, who would accept that? The conventional view completely denies it, he says. It couldn't possibly be. That I am moving towards the same thing on a wheel of recurrence, that same thing in this world of Caesar, and only divine mercy can redeem me from the wheel. that what seems to be is to those to whom it seems to be, and is productive of the most dreadful consequences to those to whom it seems to be, even of torment, despair, and eternal death. But then divine mercy steps beyond and redeems man in the body of Jesus. Jerusalem 36, William Blake. So here, the wheel returns. Now there are numerous other places where Neville refers to a wheel of recurrence. This is a good starting point to see that clearly he was talking about the wheel of recurrence on a regular basis. So as I said before, this has been discussed by Nietzsche, Indian philosophy, ancient Egypt, Pythagoras. In ancient Greece, the concept of eternal return was most prominently associated with Stoicism, the school of philosophy founded by Zeno of Citium. Although there are hints that the theory may in fact have originated with Pythagoras, the rise of Christianity brought an end to classical theories of eternal return, which were incompatible with Christian notions of free will and salvation. In Pythagoreanism, according to Porphyry, it was one of the teachings of Pythagoras that after certain periods, the same events occur. Pythagoras was from around 570 to 495 BC. He stated nothing was entirely new. Eudemus of Rhodes also references this Pythagorean doctrine in his commentary on Aristotle's Physics. In a fragment preserved by Simplicius, Eudemus writes, "One might raise the problem whether the same time recurs, as some say, or not. The same has many senses. The same in form seems to occur as do spring and winter, and the other seasons and periods. Similarly, the same changes occur in form, for the sun performs its solstices and equinoxes and its other journeys. But if someone were to believe the Pythagoreans that numerically the same things recur, then I also will romance holding my staff while you sit there, and everything else will be the same, and it is plausible to say that time will be the same." The Stoics, possibly inspired by Pythagoreans, incorporated the theory of eternal recurrence into their natural philosophy. According to Stoic physics, the universe is periodically destroyed in an immense conflagration and then experiences a rebirth. These cycles continue for eternity, and the same events are exactly repeated in every cycle. The Stoics may have found support for this doctrine in the concept of the great year, the oldest known expression of which is found in Plato's Timaeus. Plato hypothesized that one completes the cycle of time would be fulfilled when the sun, moon, and planets all completed their various circuits and returned to their original positions. Sources differ as to whether the Stoics believed that the contents of each new universe would be one and the same with those of previous universes, or are only so similar to be indistinguishable. The former point of view was attributed to the Stoic Chrysippus by Alexander of Aphrodisias, who wrote, "They hold that after the conflagration all the same things come to be again in the world numerically, so that even the same peculiarly qualified individual as before exists and comes to be again in the world, as Chrysippus says in his books on the world." On the other hand, Origen characterizes the Stoics as claiming that the contents of each cycle will not be identical, but only indistinguishable. To avoid supposing that Socrates will live again, they say that it will be someone indistinguishable from Socrates, who will marry some indistinguishable from Xanthippe, and will be accused by men indistinguishable from Anytus and Meletus. Origen also records a heterodox version of the doctrine, noting that some Stoics suggest there is a slight and very minute difference between one period and the events in the period before it. This was probably not a widely held belief, as it represents a denial of deterministic viewpoint which stands at the heart of Stoic philosophy. Now, Christian authors have attacked the doctrine of eternal recurrence on the grounds that it's incompatible with free will. Augustine of Hippo, from 354 AD, objected to the fact that salvation was not possible in the Stoic scheme, arguing that even if a temporary happiness was attained, a soul could not be truly blessed if it was doomed to return again to misery, not knowing about the promise that Neville Goddard had mentioned. Augustine also mentions certain philosophers who cite Ecclesiastes 1:9 through 10 as evidence of eternal return. That which hath been is that which shall be. Augustine denies that his reference to the recurrence of specific people, objects, and events, instead of interpreting the passage in a more general sense. In support of his argument, he appeals to scriptural passages such as Romans 6:9, which affirms that Christ, being raised from the dead, dieth no more. Eternal recurrence is one of the central concepts of the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. While the idea itself is not original to Nietzsche, his unique response to it gave new life to the theory, and speculation to the correct interpretation of Nietzsche's doctrine continues to this day. The discovery of the laws of thermodynamics in the 19th century restarted the debate among scientists and philosophers about the ultimate fate of the universe, which brought in its train many questions about the nature of time. Eduard von Hartmann argued that the universe's final state would be identical to the state in which it had began. Eugene Düring rejected this idea, claiming that it carried with it the necessary consequence that the universe would begin again, and that the same forms would repeat themselves eternally, a doctrine which Düring viewed as dangerously pessimistic. Johann Gustav Vogt, on the other hand, argued in favor of cyclical system, additionally positing the spatial coexistence of an infinite number of identical worlds. Louis Auguste Blanqui similarly claimed that in an infinite universe, every possible combination of forms must repeat itself eternally across both time and space. Nietzsche may have been drawn upon a number of sources in developing his own formulation of the theory. He had studied Pythagorean and Stoic philosophy, was familiar with the works of contemporary philosophers such as Düring and Vogt, and may have encountered references to Blanqui in a book by Friedrich Albert Long, who was also a fan of the author Heinrich Heine, one of whose books contains a passage discussing the theory of eternal return. Nevertheless, Nietzsche claimed that the doctrine as it appears in his own works struck him one day as a sudden revelation while walking beside Lake Silvaplana. The first published presentation of Nietzsche's version of the theory appears in the Gay Science section 341, where it is proposed to the reader as a thought experiment. What if someday, or night, a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke this? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you have answered him, 'You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine'?" Nietzsche expands upon this concept in the philosophical novel Thus Spoke Zarathustra, later writing that eternal return was the fundamental idea of the work. In this novel, the titular Zarathustra is initially struck with horror at the thought that all things must recur eternally. Ultimately, however, he overcomes his aversion to eternal return and embraces it as his most fervent desire. In the penultimate chapter of the book, The Drunken Song, Zarathustra declares all things are entangled, ensnared, enamored. If you ever wanted one thing twice, if you ever said, "You please me, happiness, abide moment," then you wanted all back, for all joy wants eternity. Martin Heidegger points out that Nietzsche's first mention of eternal recurrence in the Gay Science presents this concept as a hypothetical question rather than postulating it as fact. According to Heidegger, the significant point is the burden imposed by the question of eternal recurrence, regardless of whether or not such a thing could possibly be true. The concept of eternal recurrence appears similar to Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, which Nietzsche describes. "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not all eternity. Not merely to bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it." On the other hand, Nietzsche posthumously published notebooks contain an attempt at logical proof of eternal return, which is often adduced in support of the claim that Nietzsche believed in the theory as a real possibility. The proof is based upon the premise that the universe is infinite in duration, but contains a finite quantity of energy. This being the case, all matter in the universe must pass through a finite number of combinations, and each series of combinations must eventually repeat in the same order, thereby creating a circular movement of absolutely identical series. However, scholars such as Neil Sinha Babu and Kwong Un Teng have suggested that the reason this material remained unpublished was because Nietzsche himself was unconvinced that his argument would hold up to scrutiny. A third possibility is that Nietzsche was attempting to create a new ethical standard by which people should judge their own behavior. In one of his unpublished notes, Nietzsche writes, "The question which thou wilt have to answer before every deed that thou doest is this such a deed as I am prepared to perform an incalculable number of times, is the best ballast." Taken in this sense, the doctrine has been seen as comparable to the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant. Once again, however, the objection is raised that no such ethical imperative appears in any of Nietzsche's published writings, and this interpretation is therefore rejected by most modern scholars. But really, at the center of Nietzsche's philosophy is the idea of eternal return. He talked about it all the time. Why is Nietzsche important? He has been an important voice in philosophy and even in some spiritual sciences. And it's a place where this idea is discussed. The ultimate embrace of responsibility comes from eternal return. It comes from accepting the consequences, good or bad, of one's willful action. Embedded in it is an urgent exhortation to calibrate our actions in such a way as to make their consequences bearable, livable with, in a hypothetical perpetuity. But the thought experiment that Nietzsche proposes with the demon, Nietzsche's demon is a challenge, or better, a question that is to be answered, not in words, but in the course of life. The question in each and everything, do you want this again and innumerable times again, would lie on your actions as the heaviest weight. Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to long for nothing more fervently than for this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal? Are we, in the words of William Butler Yeats, content to live it all again? Being content in this sense is not being distracted from or lulled to sleep by or resigning oneself to a fate that cannot be avoided. It is to live to your heart's content with the knowledge that you will do this and everything again forever. Nietzsche suggests that the affirmation of the eternal return is possible only if one is willing and able to become well-adjusted to life and to oneself. To be well-adjusted for Nietzsche is to choose wholeheartedly what we think and where we find and create meaning. The specter of infinite monotony was for Nietzsche the abiding impetus to assume absolute responsibility. If one's choices are to be replayed endlessly, they better be the right ones. John J. Cagg, in his book Hiking with Nietzsche on Becoming Who You Are, mentions perhaps the hardest part of the eternal return is to own up to the tortures that we create for ourselves and those we create for others. Owning up, to recollect, to regret, to be responsible, ultimately to forgive and love. To accept that we will eternally return, using our imagination wisely. Perhaps Neville Goddard is the one that came along that explained for us how to escape from this eternal return. The Poincare recurrence theorem states that certain dynamical systems, such as particles of gas in a sealed container, will return infinitely, often to a state arbitrarily close to their original state. The theorem, first advanced by Henry Poincare in 1890, remains influential and is today the basis of ergodic theory. Attempts have been made to prove or disprove the possibility of Poincare recurrence in a system the size of a galaxy or a universe. You can also see references to historical return in fractals. I am most fascinated with P.D. Ouspensky, who comes really from the Russian school of thought about this and is more along the lines of Vadim Zeland and George Gurdjieff. Russian esotericist P.D. Ouspensky lived from 1878 to 1947, believed in the literal truth of eternal recurrence. As a child, he had been prone to vivid sensations of déjà vu, and when he encountered the theory of eternal return in the writings of Nietzsche, it occurred to him that this was a possible explanation for his experiences. He subsequently explored the idea in his semi-autobiographical novel, The Strange Life of Ivan Osokin. In this story, which is similar to Groundhog's Day, Ivan Osokin implores a magician to send him back to his childhood and give him the chance to live his life over again. The magician obliges, but warns Ivan that he will be unable to correct any of his mistakes. This turns out to be the case. Although Ivan always knows in advance what the outcome of his actions will be, he is unable to keep himself from repeating those actions. Having relived his life up to the point of his conversation with the magician, Ivan asks in despair whether there is any way of changing the past. The magician answers that he must change himself. If he works on improving his character, he may have a chance of making better decisions the next time around. Now, he mentions changing the past, something that Neville Goddard implies in another of his lectures, that you can use revision to escape from the wheel of recurrence by changing or revising the past in your imagination. Now, the earliest version of the novel that Ouspensky wrote, The Strange Life of Ivan Osokin, did not include the magician and ended on a totally pessimistic note. The revolution in Ouspensky's thoughts on recurrence, the idea that change is possible, took place after he became a disciple of the mystic George Gurdjieff, who taught that a person could achieve a higher state of consciousness through a system of strict self-discipline. When Ouspensky asked about the eternal recurrence, Gurdjieff told him the idea of repetition is not the full and absolute truth, but is the nearest possible approximation of the truth. And if you understand why I do not speak of this, you will be still nearer to it. What is the use of a man knowing about recurrence if he is not conscious of it, and if he himself does not change? Knowledge about the repetition of lives will add nothing for a man if he does not strive to change himself in order to escape this repetition. But if he changes something essential in himself, that is, if he attains something, this cannot be lost. Ouspensky incorporated this idea into his later writings in a new model of the universe. He argued against Nietzsche's proof of the mathematical necessity of eternal repetition, claiming that a large enough quantity of matter would be capable of an infinite number of possible combinations. According to Ouspensky, everyone is reborn again into the same life at the moment of their death, and many people will indeed continue to live the exact same lives for eternity. But it is also possible to break the cycle and enter a new plane of existence. I want to read a little bit from Ouspensky's book, The New Model of the Universe, which discusses eternal recurrence. In the chapter, Eternal Recurrence and the Laws of Manu, the fundamental problem of being, Ouspensky says, that is the enigmas of birth and death, of coming into existence and of disappearance, never leave man. Whatever he may think about, he is actually thinking of these enigmas or problems. And even when he decides with himself to leave these questions alone, in reality he seizes upon every possibility, even the most remote, and tries once more to understand something in the enigmas which he had recognized to be insoluble. Speaking generally by their attitude towards the problems of life and death, people can be divided into two categories. Most people approach these problems just as they approach all other problems and somehow solve them for themselves, either positively or negatively. In order to arrive at these solutions, they use ordinary methods of thought, the same methods and the same categories of thought as they use for thinking of the ordinary things that happen in life. They say either that after death there will be nothing, that beyond the threshold of death there will be nothing, and that beyond the threshold of death there is not and cannot be any existence, or else that there will be an existence of some sort, either like the earthly existence or different from it, and consisting either entirely of suffering or entirely of joy. But others know more than that. They realize that the problems of life and death cannot be approached in an ordinary way, that it is impossible to think of these problems in the same forms in which people think of something that happened yesterday or will happen tomorrow, but they do not go further than this. They feel that it is impossible, or at any rate useless, to think of these things simply, but what it means to think not simply, they do not know. In order to arrive at a right form of thinking in relation to these problems, it is necessary to remember that they are connected with the idea of time. We understand these problems to the extent to which we understand time. From the ordinary standpoint, man's life is taken as a line from birth to death. A man was born, lived 50 years, and died. But where he was before 1854 and where he may be after 1904 is unknown. This is the general formulation of all questions of life and death. Science deals only with man's body, and according to it, the body did not exist before it was born and is disintegrated after death. Philosophy does not take these questions seriously and considers them to be unanswerable and consequently naive. Religious teachings and various pseudo-occult, spiritualistic, and theosophical systems claim to know the solutions of these problems. In reality, of course, no one knows anything. The mystery of existence before birth and existence after death, if there is such existence, is the mystery of time, and time guards its secrets better than many people think. In order to approach these mysteries, it is necessary first to understand time itself. All ordinary attempts to answer questions about what was before and what will be after are based on the ordinary conception of time, and the same formula is applied to the problems of existence before birth and after birth, whenever such existence is admitted, i.e. the formula is taken thus: before now, after, before birth, life, after death. It is precisely here that the fundamental mistake lies. Time, in the sense of before, now, after, is the product of our life, of our being, of our perception, and, above all, of our dunking. Outside this life, outside the usual perception, the interrelation of the three phases of time can change. In any case, we have no guarantee that it will remain the same. And yet, in ordinary thought, including religious, theosophical, and occult thought, this question is never even raised. Time is regarded as something which is not subject to discussion, as something which belongs to us once and for all, and cannot be taken away from us, and which is always the same. Whatever may happen to us, time will always belong to us, and not only time, but even eternity. We use this word without understanding its true meaning. We take eternity to be an infinite extension of time, while really eternity means another dimension of time. In the 19th century, certain Eastern and pseudo-Eastern theories began to penetrate Western thought, among others the idea of reincarnation, that is, of the periodical reappearance on Earth of the same souls. This idea was not entirely unknown before, but belonged to hidden mystical thought. The popularization of this idea is chiefly due to modern theosophy with all its ramifications. The origin of the idea of reincarnation, as it is expounded in modern theosophy, is open to argument. It was adopted by theosophists practically without alteration from the cult of Krishna, which is a religion of Vedic origin, considerably retouched by reformers, but even the cult of Krishna does not contain the democratic principle of universal and equal reincarnation, which is so characteristic of modern theosophy. In the real cult of Krishna, only heroes, leaders, and teachers of humanity reincarnate. Reincarnation for the masses, for the crowd, for the householders assumes much vaguer forms. Side by side with the idea of reincarnation, there exists in India the idea of transmigration of souls, i.e. the reincarnation of the souls of human beings into animals. The idea of the transmigration of souls connects reincarnation with reward and punishment. Theosophists regard the transmigration of souls as a distortion of the idea of reincarnation by popular beliefs. But this can in no way be regarded as certain, and both the idea of reincarnation and belief in the transmigration of souls may be regarded as having originated from one common source, namely the teaching of the repetition of everything and of eternal recurrence. The idea of the eternal recurrence of things and phenomena, the idea of eternal repetition, is connected in European thought with the name of Pythagoras, and with the vague notions of the periodicity of the universe, which are found in Indian philosophy and cosmogony. This idea of periodicity cannot be clear to European thought because it becomes complete and connected only with the aid of oral commentaries, which up to the present time have never and nowhere been made public. The life of Brahma, the days and nights of Brahma, the breath of Brahma, the Kalpas, and Manvantaras, all these ideas are very obscure for European thought, but by their inner content, they are invariably associated with Pythagorean ideas of eternal recurrence. The name of Gautama the Buddha was almost, if not exactly, a contemporary of Pythagoras, and who also taught eternal recurrence, is very seldom mentioned in connection with this idea, in spite of the fact that in Buddha's teaching of the Wheel of Lives, the idea is clearer than anywhere else, although it is obscured almost beyond recognition by ignorant interpretation and translations. Nietzsche contributed a great deal to the popularization of the idea of eternal recurrence, but he has added nothing new to it. On the contrary, he introduced several wrong concepts into it, as for instance his calculation, which mathematically is altogether wrong. of the mathematical necessity for the repetition of identical worlds in the universe. Nietzsche attempts to prove the necessity for repetition in Euclidean space and in ordinary one-dimensional time. His understanding of the idea of repetition was that for somewhere in the infinite space of the universe, an Earth exactly like the one we live on must be repeated. And then the same causes will create the same effects. And as a result, there will be a room somewhere exactly like that in which I'm sitting, and in that room a man exactly like me with an exactly similar pen will write what I'm writing now. Such a construction is possible only with a naive understanding of time. Nietzsche proves the necessity for repetition roughly in the following way. According to him, if we take a certain number of units and examine their possible combinations, the combinations that occurred once are bound to recur in the course of time. If the number of units is large, repetitions will be more frequent, and if the number of units is infinite, everything is bound to repeat. This is in fact wrong simply because Nietzsche fails to see that the number of possible combinations will grow in a much higher ratio than the number of units, and consequently the number of possible repetitions, instead of increasing, will diminish. Thus, with a certain, not even infinite, but merely large number of units, the number of combinations will be infinite, and the probability of repetition will equal 0. Given an infinite number of units, even the possibility of repetition is out of the question. I wish only to show that the idea of repetition and recollection of the past, which is not in our time, is far from being foreign to Western thought. But the psychological apprehension of the idea of eternal recurrence does not necessarily lead to a logical understanding and explanation of it. In order to understand the idea of eternal recurrence and its different aspects, it is necessary to go back to the ideas of the new model of the universe. The idea of time as the fourth dimension does not contradict the ordinary views of life, so long as we take time as a straight line. This idea only brings with it a sensation of greater preordination, of greater inevitability. But the idea of time as a curve of the fourth dimension entirely changes our conception of life. If we clearly understand the meaning of this curvature, and especially when we begin to see how the curve of the fourth dimension is transformed into the curves of the fifth and sixth dimensions, our views of things and of ourselves cannot remain any longer what they were. As has been said in the preceding, according to the initial scheme of dimensions, in which dimensions are still taken as straight lines, the fifth dimension is a line perpendicular to the line of the fourth dimension and intersecting it, that is, a line which passes through every moment of time, the line of infinite existence of a moment. But how is this line formed? Where does it come from? And what follows out of it? This can be understood to a certain extent if life is taken as a series of undulatory vibrations. As we should know from the study of undulatory vibrations in the world of physical phenomena, every wave comprises in itself a complete circle. That is, the matter of the wave moves in a completed curve in the same place and for as long as the force acts which creates the wave. We should know also that every wave consists of smaller waves and is in its turn a component part of a bigger wave. If we take simply for the sake of argument days as the smaller waves which form the bigger waves of years, then the waves of years will form one great wave of life. And so long as this wave of life rolls on, the waves of days and the waves of years must rotate at their appointed places, repeating and repeating themselves. Thus, the line of the fourth dimension, the line of life or time, consists of wheels of ever-repeating days of small circles of the fifth dimension, just as a ray of light consists of a quanta of light, each rotating in its place so long as the primary shock which sends forth the particular ray persists. But in itself, a ray may be a curve, a component part of some other bigger wave. The same applies to the line of life. If we take it as one great wave consisting of the waves of days and years, we shall have to admit that the line of life moves in a curve and makes a complete revolution, coming back to the point of its departure. And if a day or a year is a wave in the undulatory movement of our life, then our whole life is a wave in some other undulatory movement of which we know nothing. As I've already pointed out, in ordinary conception, life appears as a straight line drawn from the moments of birth and death. But if we imagine that life is a wave, we shall get this figure. The point of death coincides with the point of birth. For one who has followed the development of the ideas which touch on dimensions of time, the point does not present any difficulty, but on the contrary, results naturally from all that have been said earlier. But usually after this point, there comes a question which is more difficult to answer, namely, how an identical relation between the births of different people is preserved when we know that the relation between their deaths is quite different, i.e., that it does not correspond with the relation of their births. To put it more shortly, what will happen to a man who has died before his grandmother? He must be born immediately, and his mother is as yet unborn. Two answers are possible. First, it is possible to say that at the moment when the soul touches infinity, different relations of time become adjusted, because a moment of eternity can have different time value. And second, it is possible to say that our usual concept of dimensions of time are wrong. For instance, for us, time can have different duration, 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, but it always has the same speed. Where are proofs of this? Why not suppose that time in certain limits, for instance, in relation to human life, always has the same duration but different speed? One is not more arbitrary than the other, but with the admission of this possibility, the question disappears. In my book, Tertium Organum 1, I give a drawing of the figure of the fourth dimension taken from a book by Van Manen. This figure consists of two circles, one inside the other. It is the figure of life. The small circle stands for man, the large circle for the life of man. The small circle rolls inside the large circle, which first widens, then gradually becomes more narrow and brings the small circle to the same point which it started. In rolling along the large circle, the small circle continually rotates on its own axis. This rotation in eternity in relation to time, which is movement along the larger circle. Here again we meet what appears to be a paradox. The fifth dimension inside the fourth dimension, movement along the fifth dimension, creating movement along the fourth dimension. How are we to find the beginning and the end? Which is the driving force? And which is the driven? Is it the small circle that rotates, driven by the shock which sends it round the large circle, or is it the large circle itself which is driven by the rotation of the small circles? The one drives the other, but in relation to life, taken as the large circle, eternity is to be found first in the small circles of repeating moments, days, and years, and second in the repetition of large circle, in the repetition of life, that is, in the repetition of the waves. Just as in the case of the fourth dimension, we are again faced with the fact that a higher dimension is both above and below the lower dimension. As above, so below. The fourth dimension for us lies in the world of celestial bodies and the world of molecules. The fifth dimension lies in the moments of life eternally remaining where they are, and in the repetition of life itself taken as a whole. Life in itself is time for man. For man, there is not and cannot be any other time outside the time of his life. Man is his life is his time. The way of measuring time for all by means of such phenomena as the apparent or real movement of the sun or the moon is comprehensible as being convenient for practical purposes, but it is generally forgotten that this is only a formal time accepted by common agreement. Absolute time for man is his life. There can be no other time outside this time. If I die today, tomorrow will not exist for me, but as has been said before, all theories of the future life, of existence after death, of reincarnation, contain one obvious mistake. They're all based on the usual understanding of time, that is, on the idea that tomorrow will exist after death. In reality, if it is just in this that life differs from death, man dies because his time ends. There can be no tomorrow after death, but all usual conceptions of the future life require the existence of tomorrow. What future life can there be if it suddenly appears that there is no future, no tomorrow, no time, no after? Spiritualists, theosophists, theologians, and others who know everything about the future life may find themselves in a very strange situation if the fact is realized that no after exists. What then is possible, and what may the meaning of life as a circle be? I've pointed out that the very curvature of the line of time implies the presence in it of yet another dimension, namely the fifth dimension, or eternity. And if in the usual understanding of the fourth dimension is extension of time, what can the fifth dimension or eternity be? Eternity for our mind is conceivable only under two forms, either under the form of coexistence or under the form of repetition. The form of coexistence requires space conceptions. Somewhere there exist things identical with those here, identical people, an identical world. The form of repetition requires time conceptions. Sometime everything will be repeated or is repeated, either immediately after the completion of this particular cycle, that is of the particular life, or after every moment. The latter, i.e. the immediate repetition of every moment again and again, brings this idea near the idea of coexistence. But for our mind, it is more convenient to think of the idea of repetition under the form of the repetition of cycles. One life ends and another begins. One time ends and another begins. Death is really a return to the beginning. This means that if a man was born in 1877 and died in 1912, then having died, he finds himself again in 1877 and must live the same life all over again. In dying, in completing the circle of life, he enters the same life from the other end. He is born again in the same town, in the same street, of the same parents, in the same year, and on the same day. He will have the same brothers and sisters, the same uncles and aunts, the same toys, the same kittens, the same friends, the same women. He will make the same mistakes, laugh and cry in the same way, rejoice and suffer in the same way. And when the time comes, he will die in exactly the same way as he did before. And again, at the moment of his death, it will be as though all the clocks were put back to 7:35 a.m. on the 2nd September 1877, and from this moment started again with their usual movement. The new life begins in exactly the same conditions as the preceding one, and it cannot begin in any other conditions. The only thing that can and even must be admitted is the fact of the strengthening with every life of the tendencies of the preceding life, of those tendencies which grew and increased during life, both bad and good tendencies, those which were a manifestation of strength and those were a manifestation of weakness. There exists indeed much more psychological material for the idea of eternal recurrence than is supposed, but the existence of this material is not fully realized by scientific thought. Everybody knows the sensation or descriptions of the sensation that is experienced sometimes by people, especially in childhood, the sensation that this has happened before. I spoke of this sensation in the chapter on dreams, and I pointed out there that the usual explanations account for 2 categories out of 3 of these sensations, but leave the third category unexplained. This third category is characterized by the fact that the sensation that this has happened before, though very vivid and frequent in childhood, disappears in adult life. In some cases, this special kind of foreknowledge of people, things, places, and events can be verified and established. The very rare trustworthy cases of clairvoyance belong to such foreknowledge. But in itself, the fact that these accidental recollections, even if they are really recollections, is too small to allow anything to be built upon it. A man may be perfectly justified in asking, if such a tremendous phenomenon as the repetition of lives really exists, why do we know nothing of it? Why do we not remember more? And why did not people realize it long ago? And why is it only now presented to us as a new discovery? All these questions are quite well founded, but at the same time, it is not difficult to answer them. Earlier, we discussed the transformation of a butterfly as an example of evolution. What is especially characteristic for us in the transformation of a butterfly from the point of view in question is the fact that in passing to a new level of transformation, the butterfly completely vanishes from the preceding level, dies on the preceding level, ceases to exist there. That is, loses all connection with its former existence. If a butterfly sees and learns more, it is unable to tell the caterpillar anything about it. It is already dead as a caterpillar. It has vanished from the world of caterpillars. Something analogous must happen to people to whom the mysteries of time and eternity are revealed. They know and can speak of what they know, but people will neither hear nor understand them. Sound familiar? Why did not people long ago come to the idea of eternal recurrence? But they did in fact come to it long ago. I've pointed the teaching of Pythagoras to Buddhism, to theories of reincarnation and transmigration of souls, which in their modern forms are actually only a distortion of the idea of eternal recurrence. many other ideas of the future life, various illusions in occult teachings, for instance, the very strange idea of the possibility of changing the past, various popular beliefs such as the cult of ancestors, all these are connected with the idea of recurrence. It is quite clear that the idea of recurrence cannot be popular in its pure form, primarily because it seems absurd from the standpoint of ordinary logic, since there is nothing similar to it in the world of three-dimensional sensations or in the usually accepted time. The usual view of time leaves no place for recurrence. On the contrary, according to the ordinary wisdom of the world, nothing ever returns. So even in those teachings in which originally the idea of recurrence undoubtedly existed in its pure form, as for example in Buddhism, it has become distorted and adapted to the usual understanding of time. According to recent interpretations of learned Buddhists, a man is born into a new life at the very moment of his death, but this is a continuation in time. Buddhists have rejected the absurd idea of return into the past, and their wheel of lives rolls along with the calendar. In this way, certainly they have taken away all the force from the idea, but they have made it acceptable to the masses and capable of logical explanation and interpretation. In speaking of the idea of eternal recurrence, it is necessary to understand that it cannot be proved in the ordinary way, that is, by the usual methods of observations and verification. We know but one line of time, the one on which we now live. We are one-dimensional beings in relation to time. We have no knowledge of parallel lines. Suppositions as to the existence of parallel lines cannot be proved so long as we remain on one line. In my book, Tertium Organum, I discussed what the universe of one-dimensional beings must be. These beings know nothing besides their own line. If they suppose the existence of something new, something they did not know before, for them, it would have to be on their own line, either in front of them or behind them. Our position in relation to time is exactly the same. Everything that exists must occupy a certain place in time, either in front of us or behind us. There can be nothing parallel to us. This means that we cannot prove the existence of anything parallel so long as we remain on our line. But if we attempt to break away from ordinary views and bear in mind that the supposition of the possible existence of other lines of time parallel to ours is more scientific than the usual naive one-dimensional conception of time, then the conception of life as a recurring phenomenon will be proved to be easier than we imagine. Ordinary views are based upon the assumption that the life of a man, that is the whole of his inner world, his desires, tastes, sympathies, antipathies, tendencies and habits, inclinations, capacities, talents, vices, arise out of nothing and vanish into nothing. Christian teachings speak of the possibility of a future life, that is, of life beyond the grave, but they do not speak of life before birth. According to their view, souls are born with bodies. In fact, however, it is very difficult to think of life that is of the soul or of the inner being of man as being that arises out of nothing. It is much easier to think that this being existed earlier before birth, but people do not know how to begin thinking in this direction. The theosophical theories of reincarnation, which try to stretch the life of an individual man along the line of the life of the earth, will not bear criticism from the point of view of a rightly understood idea of time. There exist dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of various ingenious theories which claim to explain all the angles and curves of man's inner world by a combination of hereditary influences and the suppressed voices of hidden inner instincts. All these theories are acceptable, each in its own way, but none of them explains everything in man. One theory explains one thing better, another explains another thing better, but much, very much, remains unexplained. It could not be otherwise, for theories of heredity, even of a dim, faraway heredity, theories of hidden instincts, of unconscious memory, can explain certain sides of man, but other sides they cannot explain, and until we find it possible to recognize that we have lived before, very much will remain in us that we shall never be able to understand. It is very difficult to accept the idea of the absolute and inevitable repetition of everything. It seems to us that if we were to remember at least something, we should be able to avoid some of the most unpleasant things. Moreover, the idea of absolute repetition does not agree with the idea of growing tendencies, which is also necessary. In this connection, it must be recognized that as regards the character of the repetition of their lives, people fall into several types or categories. There are people of absolute repetition, in whose case everything, both big and little, is transmitted from one life to another. There are people whose lives have each time the same beginning, but go on with slight variations, upwards or downwards, coming to approximately the same end. There are people in whose case lives go with a definitely ascending tendency, becoming richer and stronger outwardly. There are people whose lives, on the contrary, display a clearly marked descending line which gradually destroys all that is alive in them and reduces them to nothing. And there are people whose life contains an inner ascending line which gradually leads them out of the circle of eternal repetition and causes them to pass to another plane of being. Let us first examine the type of lives which absolute repetition is inevitable. These are, first of all, people of byte, an untranslatable Russian word signifying in its first meaning life in relation to external forms. In its second meaning, as used in literature, life in firmly established forms, peasants, byte, merchants, country landowners, byte circumstance of deeply rooted, petrified routine life. Their lives succeed one another with the monotony of the hand of the clock moving on the dial. There can be in their lives nothing unexpected, nothing accidental, no adventures. They are born and die in the same house where their fathers and grandfathers were born and died, and where their children and grandchildren will be born and will die. National calamities, wars, earthquakes, and plagues sometimes wipe thousands and hundreds of thousands of them from the face of the earth at one stroke. But apart from such events, their whole life is strictly ordered and organized on a plan. Let us imagine a merchant in an old eastern town living in fixed conditions of the established routine life which has gone on unchanged for whole centuries. He still sells carpets in the same shop where his father and grandfather and probably his great-grandfather sold carpets. His whole life from birth to death can be seen as on a map. In a certain year he takes a wife, in a certain year he puts his eldest son in the shop, in a certain year he wins a lawsuit against his neighbor, always using the same obvious method, and always in the same year, day and hour he dies, always of the same cause of having eaten too much pilaf. There can be no new events in the lives of such people, but it is just this absoluteness of repetition that creates in them some vague consciousness of the inevitability of everything that happens, a belief in fate, fatalism, and at times a strange sort of wisdom and calmness, in some cases passing into a kind of ironical contempt for people who are restless, seeking for something, striving after something. The word beat, or bite, is very largely used in connection with the theater. Bit play, bit actor, different from a character actor, bit voice, bit intonations or inflections. This is spelled B-Y-T. To another type of people of the same category of exact repetition belong historical personages, people whose lives are linked with the great cycles of life. That is to say, with the life of people, states, countries, great conquerors, reformers, leaders of the masses, revolutionaries, kings who build up empires, kings who destroy great empires, their own and their enemies. All those belong to this category. There can be no change in the lives of those people either. Every word they pronounce affects the destiny of nations, and they must know their parts perfectly. They can add nothing of their own. They can omit nothing, nor change the meaning of what they have to say. This type is especially clear if we take weak historical personages, those men whom history puts forward as though intentionally for responsible parts when empires or whole cultures are to be destroyed, such people, for instance, as the Louis XVI or Nicholas II. They do nothing, and they do not want to do anything. They only wish to be left in peace, and yet each movement, each gesture, each word of theirs, even words that seem to be uttered by mistake, such as the famous senseless dreams, have significance and either begin or end historical periods, and all of them. Not a single word can be left out, and even mistakes must be repeated. Strong personages, Napoleons, Caesars, Genghis Khans, are in no way different from weak personages. They are pieces on the same board, and equally they cannot do anything themselves, cannot say one word of themselves, cannot either add anything to or subtract anything from what they must do or say. In the case also of people who constitute the crowd on the world stage, repetition is inevitable. The crowd must know its role very well at any particular moment. No expression of popular feeling during patriotic manifestations or armed revolutions and insurrections during coronations or revolutions would be possible if the crowd could be ignorant of its role or forget its role, and this knowledge is possible only through constant repetition of the same thing. But if we pass to the separate lives of the people who form the crowd, we shall see with different people, growing tendencies produce very different results. Growing tendencies may be of two kinds, which raise the vitality, though only outwardly, and those which lower the vitality. Let us take the type which lowers the vitality, the type with a growing tendency to degeneration. Failures, drunkards, criminals, prostitutes, suicides belong to this category. With each new life, they fall more and more easily, offer less and less resistance. Their vital force gradually weakens. They become living automatons, shadows of themselves, with a single tendency, a single desire which constitutes their chief passion, their chief vice, or their chief weakness. If their life is linked up with the lives of other people, this link gradually weakens and at last disappears altogether. These people pass slowly out of life. This is exactly what happens to suicides. They are surrounded by an atmosphere of strange fatality, and at times they do not even live up to the moment of their suicide, but begin to die sooner and finally cease to be born. This is real death, for death exists just as birth exists. Souls are born and die just like bodies. The birth of all souls is the same. How it occurs is perhaps the greatest mystery in life. But the death of souls may be different. The soul may die on one plane of being and pass to a higher plane of being, and it may die altogether, become gradually reduced to nothing and vanish and cease to be. To the category of dying souls belong people who are known by their tragic fate and especially by their tragic end. It is to these people that the remarkable rule of the Eleusinian mysteries referred, a rule that has never been rightly understood and interpreted. Participation in the mysteries was barred first to criminals, second to foreigners, and finally to people in whose lives great calamities occurred. This rule has usually been interpreted in the sense that great calamities in people's lives meant the hostility of the gods or the anger of the gods caused by something that those people had done or omitted to do. But in esoteric understanding, it was certainly clear that people whose lives consist of a series of catastrophes could not be admitted to the participation in the mysteries or to initiation, because the fact of these continuous catastrophes showed that they were going downhill and could not be stopped. In seeming contrast to the descending or unsuccessful type, but in reality in exactly the same position, are people who are successful from the ordinary point of view, but successful through adaptation to the darkest or most senseless sides of life. People who quickly amass enormous fortunes, millionaires, super millionaires, successful statement of opportunist or definitely criminal activities, scientists who create bogus theories which become fashionable and arrest the development of true knowledge, philanthropists who support all forms of prohibitive legislation, inventors of high explosives and poisonous gases, sport addicts of every kind and description, prize fighters, world champions, record breakers, cinema clowns and stars, novelists, poets, musicians, painters, actors, commercially successful but having no other value, founders of crazy sects and cults and the like. In each new life, these people continue to do what they did before, spend less and less time on preparatory training, grasp sooner and sooner the technique of their business and the technique of success, attain greater and greater celebrity or fame. Some of them become infant prodigies and show their special capacities from the earliest years. The danger for the successful type of people is their success. Success hypnotizes them, makes them believe that they themselves are the cause of their success. Success makes them follow the line of least resistance, that is, sacrifice everything to success. Therefore, nothing changes in their lives, save that success is attained ever more easily and ever more mechanically. Without formulating it, they feel that their strength lies precisely in this mechanicalness, and they suppress in themselves all other desires, interests, and inclinations. Men of real science, of real art, of real thought or action differ from these chiefly in very seldom attaining success. As a rule, they begin to be recognized only long after the end of their earthly life, and this is an exceedingly favorable factor from the point of view of the repetition of their lives. The inner decomposition which almost inevitably comes with the success never sets in with them, and they start each new life striving towards their unattainable aim, every time with new strength and they sometimes begin and remember astoundingly early, like some famous musicians or thinkers. Evolution, that is, inner growth, inner development, cannot be either accidental or mechanical. The ways of evolution are the ways of Jnana Yoga, Raja Yoga, Karma Yoga, Hatha Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga, or the way of the special doctrine accessible only to few, which was mentioned earlier in the chapter on yoga, the 5 yogas, and the way of the special doctrine and the ways of work on oneself for people of different inner type. But all the ways are equally difficult. All the ways equally demand the whole of man. People of the descending type are excluded from the outset. No evolution is possible for them, for they are incapable of any long and sustained effort, whereas evolution is the result of long and persistent work in a definite direction. In exactly the same position are people of the successful type. People of the failing type are hindered by their failure. People of the successful type are hindered by their success. For people of the bit, or for historical personages, evolution is possible only through very difficult hidden karma yoga. They can make no outward changes, and if by some miracle they begin to realize their position and solve the chief enigma of life, they must play a role, must pretend that they do not notice or understand anything besides karma yoga. Bhakti yoga is possible for them in some cases. Karma yoga shows them that it is possible to change inwardly without changing outwardly, and that only the inward change is of importance. This is an extremely difficult way, an impossible way, and it requires a great amount of help from somebody who can help. Evolution for all categories of people is connected with recollections. Recollection of an unknown past has been spoken of earlier, and recollection may be very different in quality and may have very different properties. The evolving individual remembers, although vaguely, his previous lives, but as evolution means escaping from the wheel of the 5th dimension and passing into the spiral of the 6th dimension, recollection has importance only when it bears an active character in a certain definite direction, when it creates discontent with what exists and a longing for new ways. By this I mean that recollection by itself does not create evolution. On the contrary, it may be the cause of still worse bondage in life. That is, in the 5th dimension, in these cases, recollection takes either routine life forms or pathological forms, hiding itself behind one or another kind of emotional or practical attitude to life. Sometimes a man definitely begins to think that he knows what is bound to happen. If he is of the successful type, he ascribes it to his sagacity, astuteness, clearness of mind, and so on. In reality, it is all recollection, though unconscious recollection. A man feels that he has already walked along this road. He almost knows what will be beyond the next turning, and naturally, in all these cases, recollection produces pride, self-assurance, and conceit instead of dissatisfaction. People of absolute repetition, that is, people of routine life, and also historical personages, can have sometimes almost conscious recollection, but it does not awaken them and only binds them more and more to trifles, to things, to customs, to words, to rituals, to gestures, and makes it still more difficult for them to stand apart from themselves and to look at themselves from the outside. A businessman explains this recollection by his experience, his capacity to think quickly, to guess correctly, by his flair, by his business instinct, by his intuition. In the case of great soldiers and statesmen, revolutionary leaders, navigators who discover new lands, inventors, scientists who create new theories, writers, musicians, artists, it is explained by talent or genius or inspiration. In some people, recollection evokes mad bravery or a continual desire to play with their lives. They feel that this cannot happen to them. They cannot be killed like other ordinary people. Such are many historical personages, men of destiny. With people of the descending type, also recollection can be very vivid, but it only intensifies their feeling of the ground crumbling beneath their feet. It intensifies their despair and discontent, which manifest themselves in the form of hatred, spite, or impotent anguish in crimes or excesses. Thus, recollection does not itself lead to evolution, but evolution at a certain stage arouses recollection. In this case, however, recollection is not clouded by a superior or inferior personal interpretation, but becomes more and more conscious. This is almost all that can be said about eternal recurrence, making use of the material within general reach. There remains to be established the relation of the idea of eternal recurrence to the idea of reincarnation, as it is treated in some teachings. I've mentioned before the idea of reincarnation can be regarded as a distortion of the idea of eternal recurrence. And in many cases this is true, although at the same time there are grounds for thinking that the idea of reincarnation has an independent meaning. This meaning can be found only in certain allusions contained in Indian scriptures and in a very few authors in later mystical literature. But before passing to the origin of the idea of reincarnation or its independent meaning, I want to set forth in a short form some of the best known interpretations of this idea. In modern theosophy, which has been said before, of all Indian teaching stands nearest to the cult of Krishna, man is regarded as a complex being consisting of 7 bodies. The higher or the finer of these bodies, the 7th, the 6th, and the 5th are but principles contained in the 4th body. The 4th body of man is immortal and can reincarnate. This means that after death of the physical body and after the successive deaths of the 2nd astral and 3rd mental bodies, which sometimes lives very long after death of the physical body, the 4th, the causal body, reincarnates in a new human being born after a considerable lapse of time in entirely different new conditions. According to theosophical authors, several hundred years and very often 1,000 or even 2,000 years elapse between one reincarnation and another. It must also be noted that the state of the higher bodies, that is the astral, the mental, and the causal, is very different at different stages of man's evolution. In a man who is but little developed, the causal body is hardly more than a principle. It carries with it no recollections. A new reincarnation is, as it were, an independent life. It is only in comparatively high stages of development that the causal body may carry some dim recollections of a former life. The idea of reincarnation is connected with the idea of karma. Karma is understood as a chain of causes and effects handed down from one life to another. But into the abstract idea of karma is introduced the idea of retribution. Thus, a man's actions towards other people in one life may provoke similar actions on the part of those or of other people towards him in another life. Or the same results may be the outcome of accidental causes. Thus, the existence of cripples or of people suffering from painful and revolting diseases is explained by the cruelties committed by these people in their past life. This is supposed to mean that their own suffering redeems suffering caused by them. In reality, in the idea of karma, suffering in itself has no redeeming power. A man must only understand something from suffering, must change inwardly, and must then begin to act in a different way from before. Then the new karma will, so to speak, wipe out the old one, and a man's sufferings will cease. Other teachings which accept the idea of reincarnation differ from theosophy only formally in certain details. Thus, European spiritualistic teachings recognize the possibility of a quicker reincarnation, not after hundreds or thousands of years, but after a few years or months. Modern Buddhism, as was mentioned before, recognizes immediate reincarnation after death. In this last case, the reincarnating principle, in view of the fact that existence of the soul is denied in Buddhism, is the last thought of the dying man. In all these conceptions of reincarnation, there does not appear to be the slightest doubt regarding the correctness of the usual conception of time, and it is this above all which deprives them of all force and all significance. Time is taken as though it actually existed and were such as it is conceived to be in ordinary thinking, and it is taken as such without any limitation or without any argument. The clock, the calendar, history, geological periods, astronomical cycles evoke no doubt in ordinary thought, but unfortunately, this old-fashioned time is in need of very serious amendment. I pointed out in Tertium Organum that in relation to the idea of time, Eastern writings have gone much further than Western philosophy. Eastern theosophists are very fond of quoting words from the Vedanta about the eternal now. But between the eternal now and the calendar, there are many intermediate stages, and it is just of these intermediate stages that they know nothing. Man dies. The cycle of his life is dosed. And even if the consciousness or the soul is preserved, time disappears. This means that there is no time for the soul. The soul finds itself in eternity. The next day after death, the next year, the next century do not exist for the soul. In eternity, there can be no direction before, after. There cannot be before on one side in one direction and after on another side, but there must be both, before and after, on all sides. If the soul, that is, the completed life, is attracted anywhere, it can be attracted either into before or into after along any greater line, at the point of intersection of which it is found. It follows that if reincarnation is possible, it is possible in any direction of eternity. Let us imagine that for the completed cycle of the life of a man, the great line is the line of the existence of the earth. Then the path of the soul can lie along this line in both directions, not necessarily in one direction only. The errors in our reckoning of time lie in the fact that when we think of time, we straighten out several curves simultaneously: the life of man, the lives of the big organisms of human societies, the life of the whole of humanity, the life of the earth, the life of the sun, and take them as parallel lines, and moreover, as commensurable lines capable of being expressed in the same units of measure. In reality, this is impossible, for these curves are both incommensurable and not parallel. We ascribe to them this parallel quality only owing to the linear quality of our thinking and the linear quality of our conception of time. Difficult though it is for us to get rid of linear thinking and linear conceptions, we nevertheless know enough to be able to understand that time measured by hours, days, geological periods, and light years, does not exist. And therefore it is impossible to speak of time for a completed circle only when this circle catches again onto some larger circle. But where will it catch on? To the right or to the left, before or after? As in no way predetermined, we overlook the fact that the predetermination presumed by us is exclusively based on the imaginary analogy of the division of a small circle with divisions of large circles, and this analogy is built on the supposition that a large circle must be divided into before and after at the point at which the small circle, a life or a soul, happens to be on it, like the division of the small circle into the before and after during the life of man, with the condition that the direction from before to after must be the same in both cases. It is perfectly clear that all these suppositions and analogies have no basis, and that the direction of the possible motion of the small circle in eternity is not in any way predetermined. It is possible to admit this small circle, that is, the soul or life, is subject to some kind of magnetic influences which may attract it to one or another point of one or another large circle, but these influences must come from varied directions. One may not agree with all the deductions from above arguments, but with a certain understanding of the matter, it is no longer possible to dispute the impossibility of a non-relative time. That is, a general time taken for everything that exists. In every given case, time is only the period of existence of the subject in question, and even this alone makes it impossible to regard time after death in the same way as time before death. What does the change we call death actually mean? As was shown earlier, this change means that the time of the given individual ends. Death means that there is no more time. When the angel of the apocalypse says that there should be time no longer, he speaks of the death of humanity. All this makes quite clear the impossibility of an elementary treatment of the question without an analysis of the problems of time. Reincarnation, if it exists at all, is a much more complicated phenomenon to understand, which one must have a certain knowledge of the laws of time and eternity. The laws of time and eternity are illogical laws. They cannot be studied with the 4 rules of arithmetic. In order to understand them, one must be able to think irrationally and without facts. There is nothing more deceptive than facts when we cannot have all the facts referring to the matter under discussion and are forced to deal with accessible facts, which instead of helping us, only distort our vision. And how can we know that we have a sufficient quantity of facts for judgment in one direction or another if we have no general plan of things and no general system? Our scientific system is based on facts as deficient as the facts themselves. In order to come to the laws of time and eternity, we must start with the understanding of the state in which there is no time and no eternity opposed to one another. The eternal now is the state of Brahma, the state in which everything is everywhere and always. That is, in which every point of space touches every point of time, and which in symbolism is expressed by 2 intersecting triangles, a 6-pointed star. In this combination, time is 3-dimensional, just as space is 3-dimensional, but there is great difference between the 3-dimensional time of Brahma and ordinary human one-dimensional time, the line of time which comes from an unknown past and disappears into an unknown future. And this difference is not merely subjective. Man is in fact a one-dimensional being in relation to time. This means that in leaving the line of time, in dying, man does not immediately find himself in the state of Brahma, or the eternal now. There must be many intermediate states, and it is these intermediate states that we must now examine. If we take as the point of departure the proposition that the aim of the evolution of the human soul must be the attainment of the state of Brahma, of the eternal now, then the direction of our thought becomes clear. From this point of view, man, that is his soul, taking this word without any sophistry, simply in the sense of man's inner being, of his inner existence, of which his body is the temporary receptacle, is a spark of Brahma, a seed of Brahma, which by evolving and developing can attain to the state of Brahma in the same way as the seed of an oak, by sprouting and growing, becomes an oak and in its turn produces similar seeds. But the analogy with an oak, a butterfly, or any other living being, while demonstrating correctly certain aspects of the evolution of man, obscures other sides of this evolution. The analogy of an oak, etc., does not contain the eternal now. If we want to introduce the eternal now, we must use another analogy. Let us compare Brahma to a river. He is the source of the river, he is the river itself, and he is also the sea into which the river flows. A drop of water in the river, having emerged from Brahma, wishes to return to Brahma. Brahma is all. He is the river, the sea, and the source. But to return to Brahma means to return to the source, because otherwise, if the drop is satisfied with a philosophical contemplation of its own possibilities, it may say to itself that it is already in Brahma because Brahma is all, and once the drop is in the river, it is in Brahma. And once it flows with the river towards the sea, which is also Brahma, it approaches still nearer to the merging with Brahma. But actually, in this way, it may be further and further removed from the source, and Brahma is the source. In order to unite with Brahma, the drop must return to the source. How can the drop return to the source? Only by moving against the current of the river, against the current of time. The river flows in the direction of time. A return to the source must be a movement against time, a movement not into the future, but into the past. Life as we know it, all the external and all the internal life of everything living flows in one direction from the past to the future. And all the examples of evolution we are able to find also proceed from the past towards the future. Of course, it only appears to us to be so, and it appears so because we build our straight line of time from a multitude of curves, such as the lives of men, the lives of peoples, races, etc. For this purpose, we artificially straighten out these curves, but they remain straight only so long as we keep them in our mind. That is, so long as we deliberately see them as straight lines. As soon as we let our attention relax, as soon as we leave some of these lines and pass to others or to the imaginary whole, they immediately become curves again and thus destroy the entire picture of the whole. At the same time, so long as we see only one line of time, only one current, and cannot see the parallel currents which must undoubtedly exist, because after all, time taken as a surface is not a flat surface, but must necessarily be a kind of spherical surface on which the beginning of a line is also its end, and the end is its beginning. Let us take again the idea of return to Brahma. Brahma has created the world, or the world has emerged and is emerging from Brahma. Three ways must lead to Brahma: movement forward into the future, movement backward into the past, and movement on one spot in the present. What is movement into the future? It is the process of life, the process of reproducing oneself in others, the process of the growth and development of human groups and of the whole of humanity. Whether there is evolution in this process is a question open to dispute. What is clear is the picture of the formation, existence, and dying of the big jelly-like organisms which fight each other and devour each other, that is, of human societies, people, and races. What is movement on one spot in the present? It is movement along the circle of eternal recurrence, the repetition of life, and the inner growth of the soul which becomes possible owing to that repetition. What is movement backward into the past? It is the path of reincarnation which, if it is possible and exists, probably exists only in the form of reincarnation into the past. This is precisely the hidden esoteric side of the idea of reincarnation, which is so completely forgotten that even allusions to it are difficult to find. But such allusions exist. I will only point to some strange expressions in the Old Testament. King David says, "In dying, I go the way of all the earth." 1 Kings 2:2. Joshua says, "And behold, this day I am going the way of all the earth." Joshua 23:14. What is the meaning of these words? What does the way of the earth mean? The way of the earth is its past. I go the way of the earth can mean only one thing. I go in time. I go into the past. There are also other expressions. Aaron shall be gathered unto his people. God says this to Moses and Aaron in Mount Hor, Numbers 20 and 24. "And die in the mount whither thou goest up, and be gathered unto thy people, as Aaron thy brother died in Mount Hor, and was gathered unto his people," God says to Moses, Deuteronomy 32:50. "Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people," Genesis 25:8. "And Isaac gave up the ghost and died and was gathered unto his people," Genesis 35:29. "I am to be gathered unto my people." Jacob, Genesis 49:29, "and yielded up to the ghost, and was gathered unto his people," Jacob, Genesis 49:33. "Behold, therefore, I will gather thee unto my fathers, and thou shalt be gathered into thy grave in peace, and thine eyes shall not see all the evil which I will bring upon this place." 2 Kings 22:20. The words "to be gathered unto his people" have exactly the same meaning as the words "to go the way of all the earth." And the last passage, "I will gather thee unto the fathers," even points out the benefit of resulting from it, that is, escape from the evil of the present. In the usual interpretation, these words are regarded either as indicating a life after death in which man joins his ancestors who have passed there before him, or in a more materialistic sense, as burial in family tombs. But the first, that is, the interpretation explaining these words by existence after death, does not bear criticism, for it is well known that Judaism contained no idea of existence after death. Had there been such an idea, it would necessarily have been expounded and interpreted in the Bible. Neither does the second explanation, that is, burial in family tombs, answer all the indications mentioned, for the same words also refer to Aaron and to Moses, who died and were buried in the desert. And what is particularly important to the expressions "to go the way of all the earth," to be gathered unto one's fathers, or to be gathered unto one's peoples, never refer to ordinary men or women. These expressions are used only in relation to very few patriarchs, prophets, and leaders of the people. This points to the hidden meaning and hidden aim of reincarnation in the past. In the great stream of life which flows from its source, there must necessarily be contrary and transverse currents. Just as in a tree there is a flow of sap from roots to leaves, and a flow of sap from leaves to roots. In the great stream of life, the evolutionary movement must be a movement contrary to the general process of growth, a movement against the current, a movement towards the beginning of time, which is the beginning of all. Bound to his wheel of repeating lives, man would be unable to avail himself of the possibility of a reverse movement against time. If there were no possibility of reincarnation in another age, in another epoch, near or distant, but at any rate in one near to the beginning, that is, one which is in the past. That is a very strange theory at the first glance. The idea of a backward movement in time is unknown and incomprehensible to us. Actually, however, this idea alone explains the possibility of evolution in the true and large meaning of the word. Evolution, i.e. improvement, must come from the past. It is not enough to evolve in the future. Even if this were possible, we cannot leave behind the sins of our past. We must not forget that nothing disappears. Everything is eternal. Everything that has been is still in existence. The whole history of humanity is the history of crime, and the material for this history continually grows. We cannot go far forward with such a past as ours. The past still exists, and it gives and will give its results, creating new and ever new crimes. Evil begets evil. In order to destroy the evil consequence, it is necessary to destroy the evil cause. If the cause of the evil lies in the past, it is useless to look for it in the present. And man must go back, seek for, and destroy the causes of evil, however far back they may lie. It is only in this idea that a hint of the possibility of a general evolution can be found. It is only in this idea that the possibility of changing the karma of humanity lies, because changing the karma means changing the past. The theosophical theory is that every man receives as much evil as he produces. This is karma according to theosophical conception, but in this way evil cannot diminish and must necessarily grow. And humanity has no right to dream of a beautiful and bright future while it drags behind it such a trail of evil and crime which is automatically renewed. The idea of what humanity should do with the load of evil and crime it has accumulated occupied the minds of many thinkers. Dostoevsky could never get free of the horror of the past sufferings of people long since dead and vanished. And fundamentally, he was undoubtedly right. Evil, once created, remains and breeds new evil. Of the better-known great teachers of humanity and founders of religions, only Christ and Buddha never advocated any form of struggle with evil by means of violence, that is, by means of new evil. But what has been the outcome of the preaching of love and mercy we know very well. If evil can be uprooted and its consequences destroyed, this can only be if it is arrested at the moment of its inception, and arrested not by means of another evil. All the absurdity of the struggle for a better organization of life on earth is due to the fact that people attempt to fight the results, leaving the causes of evil and creating new causes of new evil. And yet the precept, "Do not oppose evil by evil," cannot produce any results, because on their level of development, people can only be either indifferent to evil or struggle with evil by means of violence, that is, by means of another evil. This struggle is always a struggle against results. People can never reach the causes of evil. It is easy to understand why this is so. The causes of evil are not in the present, they are in the past. There would be no possibility of thinking of the evolution of humanity if the possibility did not exist for individually evolving men to go into the past and struggle against the causes of the present evil which lie there. This explains where those people disappear who have remembered their past lives. From the ordinary point of view, this sounds like an absurdity. But the idea of reincarnation contains this absurdity, or this possibility. In order to admit the possibility of reincarnation into the past, it becomes necessary to presume plurality of existence, or again, coexistence. That is to say, it becomes necessary to suppose that the life of man, while repeating according to the law of eternal recurrence at one place in time, if it can be put thus, simultaneously occurs at another place in time, and it can be said with almost complete certainty that a man, even approaching the superhuman state, will not be conscious of that simultaneity of lives and will remember one life, or the life at one place in time, as past and feel the others as present. In the conditions of three-dimensional space and one-dimensional time, plurality of existence is impossible, but under the conditions of six-dimensional space-time, it is quite natural, because in it every point of time touches every point of space, and everything is everywhere and always. In the space-time represented by two intersecting triangles, there is nothing strange or impossible in the idea of plurality of existence, and even an approach to these conditions creates for man the possibility to go the way of all the earth, or to be gathered to his fathers, which enables him to influence his ancestors or their contemporaries, gradually to change and to make favorable the conditions of his birth, and gradually to surround himself with people who also remember. Let us try to imagine such a situation in a more concrete form. Let us suppose that we know that the whole life of a certain man has shaped in a certain way, owing to certain things which have been done or not done by his grandfather, who died before his birth. Let us now imagine that the man has the possibility of influencing his grandfather in a certain way at a right moment through some of his contemporaries, perhaps simply of opening his eyes to something he did not know. This may entirely change the conditions of that man's subsequent life, afford him new possibilities, and so on. Let us suppose again that a certain man who has actual power in his hands, a statesman or a politician or reigning sovereign or some past epoch, manifested an interest in the direction of real knowledge. This would have given the possibility of influencing him if there had been a man near him or who could do it. Let us suppose that such a man happens to be beside him. This might give unexpected results of a very useful character, opening up new possibilities for a large number of people. Ouspensky goes on and talks about this even further, talking about the conditions for birth and a whole variety of other subjects. The first question that arises from the point of view of eternal recurrence is this, Ouspensky says: is it possible that all the dramatis personae of the gospel drama are destined eternally to play their parts, eternally to say the same words, eternally to do the same thing? In order to answer this question, it is necessary to understand clearly that in the gospel drama, there are two kinds of part and two kinds of actor. The same words must be said, the same deeds must be done, the same scenes must be enacted before the spectators and before history. But in the one case, the actors are always the same. In the other, they may be different. The actor who once played Judas will always play Judas, but the actor who once played Christ may next time play some other conscious part, for instance, that of John the Baptist. The apostles may exchange roles, but there may have been some among them who did not know their roles thoroughly enough or attempted to alter them, to introduce something of their own, to improve something. These will have to play the same roles over and over again until they have learned them to perfection and remember them word for word. We do not know their mistakes, for mistakes were corrected in the Gospels, which were written by men who understood the meaning and purpose of the drama of Christ. But this actual story might easily have differed in its details from the story described in the Gospels. The apostles may not only exchange roles or act better the next time, but they may pass over to more important, more central roles in the drama, and each of them may hope someday to play Christ. These are conscious roles. Unconscious roles cannot change. The priests who tried Jesus and incited the people against him, all the people who formed the crowd that demanded his death, the soldiers who parted his garments, and so on, will play their roles without the slightest change. The unconscious roles of the gospel drama are firmly fixed in their invariable repetition. What else can a man cry who has cried, "Crucify him"? It is absolutely impossible for him to cry anything else, or even to think of anything else, and he will go on crying it through all the cycles of eternity. What can Pilate do or say differently? He can do nothing. He can only wash his hands again. All these people have crucified themselves, have nailed themselves to the cross of Jesus for all eternity, and no power can tear them from this cross. There is deep meaning in the myth of the wandering or eternal Jew. He eternally says and will say, "Go on quicker." The legend of the wandering Jew refers to the man whose doors Jesus wished to rest while carrying the cross, and who cried to him, "Go on quicker," and was cursed by Jesus and made to wander eternally, having no possibility either of dying or of resting. The legend has been known in literature since the beginning of the 17th century. There's another version of it which existed in the 13th century. There can be no mistake in the unconscious roles, because each man played his unconscious role for the first time according to his type, education, environment, epoch, in obeying the crowd instinct, in imitating other people, and so on. The next time his role was repeated mechanically, and the more he played it, the more thoroughly he knew his role, the less possibility was there of mistake or misunderstanding. Eternal repetition took control of his role, and make no mistake, it was any longer possible. The producer of the drama of Christ could rely on the unconscious roles as surely as he could rely on the scenery of Judea, on customs and feast days and the like. But conscious roles require preparation. In the further development of Christianity, esoteric Christianity became a school for training actors for this drama. The drama itself, so to speak, was an examination performance. All this together gave a very interesting picture. The drama as the beginning, as the source, created religion, and the religion as the result, as the river by its reverse current fed the source. The mental image of all this suggested the cosmic process, the transformation of Christianity into the church, the pact between church and state, the distortion and perversion of the original idea of the religion of love until it descended to the preaching of Christianity sword in hand, the slaughter of heretics, the Inquisition. All these were a result of the gospel drama. Such was the inevitable outcome of the work of the selection and separation of people capable of taking up esoteric work from among the masses of ordinary humans. Ouspensky goes on to say, in connection with the question of the relationship of the ideas of eternal recurrence and reincarnation in the past to ideas of evolution, it is interesting to see whether any social theories exist in esotericism. That is, whether esoteric teachings conceive any possibility of an organization of human groups or communities which would help the given culture to attain the greatest results and which generally would help the evolution of humanity. This is particularly interesting in our times when such great importance is attached to social theories of every kind, and when the most fantastic speculations in this domain are elevated to the rank of sciences or dogmatized directly as a kind of rationalistic religion. An answer to these questions exists. The esoteric idea of the ideal organization of humanity is division into castes according to the laws of Manu. In the code of the Laws of Manu, as it is known and has come down to us, division into caste is put as the cornerstone of the whole social structure, and the very essence of the nature of man is regarded as being the cause of this division on the basis of which man was created. There's a whole section here where he goes into the Laws of Manu. I read the majority of this chapter because I thought it was an important discussion in further detail of the things that Neville Goddard discusses when he talks about the wheel of recurrence. Perhaps we can see where Neville Goddard obtained some of these ideas. The interesting thing is Neville Goddard was talking about escaping from this wheel of recurrence through the imagination and in revision by changing our past. And we see Ouspensky talking about changing the past as a form of evolution, being able to consciously be aware of our role in the present and our parallel lives, and to be able to consciously change our pasts, something that Neville Goddard moves beyond Ouspensky in discussing in his idea of revision. These are fascinating concepts, amazing traditions of scholarship that finally corroborate what Neville Goddard was saying because of his experiences. Neville Goddard was not saying it may be a wheel of recurrence, as Ouspensky is. No, he is saying it is recurrence. I know this. I've been given this information. I've experienced it. I have seen people that are experiencing it. Neville Goddard implied that these worlds existed outside of our own. They're not necessarily ours. Ouspensky would seem to imply that these are the same worlds, and his discussion of the different sorts of people and whether or not they evolve and are asleep is fascinating to me. I believe I've experienced something like this life many times. As I mentioned to you, my discussion with Josiah Brandt on the bus when we were doing the Neville Goddard tour, he said that he's experiencing deja vu all the time. So I'm asking you, are you seemingly experiencing what appears to be deja vu all the time? This is knowing. This means that you are conscious. So there's a couple things that you can pull from this. Use your imagination to escape this drama. You can create whatever you want in this world, and God will begin to notice those that are escaping from the wheel by the changes in the world around them from what they usually do in every single repetition. We already know the script, and suddenly the script changes. Oh, there's somebody over there that is imagining their own world. And that is when you begin the process to awaken as God, and you move on to a whole other drama. You're in a Groundhog's Day life as a soul. Now, there's an implication in here which I don't necessarily agree with, that the soul can die. I don't think that's true, but there is a point where the soul can be entirely diminished when it goes in a spiral downward. In my book, and more importantly, I was referring to Frederick Dotson's book. He refers to time as like a lake, like a circle, and not as a straight line. And I took that idea upon my understanding of the time, and I found it to be important. You can change time. You can go back in time. You can change time. And in doing so, we may be elevating ourselves from the eternal recurrence or the eternal return. Please let me know what you think of this groundbreaking concept. Joseph Murphy, who was also trained by Abdullah, and I'm not sure Abdullah trained this or not, but Joseph Murphy's book, The Wheel of Truth, and some of his other books sort of deny reincarnation, but don't necessarily talk about recurrence, but imply it. There's some other authors, but most of all, I found just some excitement in the idea that this is not exclusively with Neville that he was coming from more than just one author, but a whole grouping of historical authors that had pondered eternal recurrence. And he had built this into his philosophy, or it came out from his understandings of what he experienced. So please let me know your thoughts on this. And if you want me to explore this further, I certainly can. There's not much more to find, but please send me any links or ideas where the eternal recurrence is discussed further. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com. Buy my art at newearth.art. To the Reality Revolution.